When did the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints first come to Africa? Well, the story begins in 1853. But the question might be, who were the first missionaries? Who were the first people they baptized? What were the challenges that they faced? Well, how did the church eventually grow from a little corner of Cape Town to across the African continent? Today, we are going back to the beginning. The president of the church in 1852 is Brigham Young. And so on the 28th of August, he calls 3 missionaries to go and open the South Africa mission. Their names were Jesse C. Haven, Leonard I. Smith, and William H. Walker. And so on the 15th of September, 1852, these 3 missionaries leave Salt Lake City. They head out to Cape Town. They don't know anyone. They do not know the language that will be spoken there. They do not have anyone they know for a fact will be listening or even waiting for them. They don't know whether they will arrive there safely or not. And I'm thinking this must have been overwhelming. But trusting the prophet, trusting the Lord, they head out on this mission. And so in the historical sources of the church, we are told that on the 18th of April, 1853, they arrive in Cape Town. And so this is about a trip for about 7 months by sea. And my first time in Cape Town, I realized that this is the experience that these 3 missionaries must have had. Seeing that Table Mountain, just getting a glimpse of it from the boat, whatever they used to travel by sea. And I'm thinking when they saw the mountain and realizing that they've made their journey, their destination is just yonder. I'm thinking this must have been an exciting time for these 3 missionaries, but more so for those that they were going to meet. And so we learn that they faced a lot of challenges. So they land now in Cape Town, and so the story begins in Cape Town. They go around Cape Town looking now for people to listen to, or people to listen to them rather. So they go out and searching for people they can teach. These are people who they've never met, they don't know any of them, and so a bit of maybe worry in their eyes. Will they be respected? Will they be? So these 3 missionaries begin to teach immediately. And so they head out to the streets of Cape Town, and they start looking for people to teach. But we are told that this was not an easy experience. We are told that in the historical sources of the church, if you go to church history, we are told that these missionaries were heckled. Some of the preachers of the day used to disrupt their teaching or their meetings when they were busy teaching. We are even told that at some point, they would have eggs and vegetables being thrown at them, and that's how they were disrupted. And I'm sure this must have been a very, very difficult time. They, like I said, they did not have friends there. They did not have anyone they knew there. It was just the 3 of them and the gospel and the new friends that they were about to make. And so I'm sure discouragement crept in as well. And we are told, they tried to move from street to street, place to place, trying to find those who will be receptive to this message that they were bringing through the sea. And so William Walker, we are told that he so interestingly, when William Walker was moving around from street to street or place to place, after this disruptions and all this heckling and eggs being thrown in their faces, he probably isolates himself from the others and tries to go and look for a more productive place where he can be able to teach, because I'm sure that's what he really wanted to do the most. And he walks around and eventually lands in Mowbray, and we are told that he was rejected about 16 times before he reached this one door in Mowbray. And we are told that the gentleman who opened the door that he knocked is Nicholas Paul. And so he makes a new friend now. And I'm sure this was welcomed with joyous hands and a glad heart to say, finally, someone is receptive to me. And we learn that Nicholas Paul then opens up his house and allows these missionaries now to use his house to not only lodge in, but also to use it for meeting purposes. And so they would use now his house to teach the gospel of Jesus Christ, the gospel that these missionaries. So 1 month after arriving in Cape Town, the 3 missionaries then go up the Lion's Head. If you've been to the Lion's Head, you know how beautiful that scenery is. I've been there myself, and I can tell you it's a beautiful place. And I'm sure when they got up there and looking over this land now, that they were about to embark on this journey of finding souls, and the church says in their historical sources that they went up there to dedicate the country for the preaching of the gospel. And so we learn that on the 23rd of May, 1853, these missionaries then dedicate the land for the preaching of the gospel. So now to declare their intention, after being rejected, after all the challenges that they've been through, the long travel. Now they finally arrived, and now they are making their intentions clear that now we are here to open this mission, to start preaching the gospel in this land. And so the dedication. So what happens 3 days later? Well, after they've dedicated the land for missionary work, we are told that on the 26th of May, 1853, something very exciting happens. They get their first baptism, and not just one, two. So we are told that there was a man by the name of Joseph Peterson and John Dodell, who historically the records say that they were some of the first converts, because there are others who might be in the records that we are not aware of. But I know of a name that is also in the records stating that he was also one of the first to be baptized. So the new records now, or the revised records of the South Africa history, shows that these two were among the first, and hence I mentioned their names, to be baptized. So on the 18th of April 1853, they arrive in Cape Town. On the 23rd of May 1853, they dedicate the land for missionary work. On the 26th of May 1853, their first baptism. The first converts of the church are welcomed into the fold. So this was only the beginning. And so I'm thinking these missionaries, having traversed through the Mowbray area, and if you go to Mowbray, and that's something very interesting about the church history, is if you go to Mowbray, and if you really want to understand how deep the church was in the Mowbray area, you'll find that there are streets which are named after Book of Mormon prophets. If you go to Mowbray, you'll find Alma Street, you'll find Mohon Rai Street, and you could see that the culture of the church was really taking deep root in that particular area. But now, I'm sure the missionaries started now to travel or move to other areas, because they now, on the 5th of July, have another baptism. In 1853, they baptized a lady by the name of Johanna Langeveld Provis. And so she came from the colored community, so they would maybe put it in terms such as mixed race. And she was one of the mixed races from the Afrikaner community, so to speak, who was then baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And Johanna became a very important figure in the South African history in terms of the LDS history, because in 1854 she started teaching Jesse Haven the Afrikaans language. Now, if you know the history of South Africa, you'll know that within the Cape Colony, the Dutch were really established here. And so that Afrikaner language is sort of like a dialect from the Dutch, where they were now starting to be able to communicate with the natives as settlers, so to put it. And so she now teaches Jesse this Afrikaans language, so that he could be able to then go into the more African community to teach other races which were different from the conventional ones, which were the more English-speaking community members. And so she became that great important. Now, on the 16th of August 1853, the first Mowbray branch is organized, and it becomes the first branch in the African continent. And guess who is called to be the first branch president? Nicholas Paul. Yes, the same man who opened his doors or his house to offer shelter to William Walker. He's now called to serve as its first ecclesiastical leader. And I'm sure it must have been exciting for him, but more so to those who first met him and eventually taught him the gospel, that he received it to an extent that he was then baptized and became a member of. And as a missionary, trust me, there's no more joy than that. Seeing someone that you brought into the fold, living faithfully and worthily to an extent of being called and chosen to be amongst the first to lead the church. And so the church continues to grow in the Cape Town area, because we are told that in 1855 November, they have a conference, the Cape Town area. And we are told in the church historical sources that the conference had in attendance 6 branches and about 176 converts in attendance. And to some, that might sound like a small feat, but trust me, when you do missionary work and for such a short period of time, you understand that that was a miracle, and the Lord really did work wonders in this Cape Town. So obviously the church then continues to grow, but it comes with a challenge. And the challenge is that many of the saints wanted to live to the west, to go and gather with the rest of the saints. If you go through church history, you'll understand how, there was a call for the saints to go to Zion, and these missionaries obviously told these members about a prophet in the west and about how the Lord has commanded us to gather in Zion. And so they want to be faithful. They also want to go and meet with the other saints. And so many of them want to leave South Africa to go and join the other saints in the West. And so they do. But many of them stayed. And there is something also that we cannot ignore, and that is a fact that, during that time, if you look at the chronological dates, you'll realize that when the church was being introduced to the African continent, it was at the same period where the church was putting now a restriction that the priesthood and temple ordinances should be or would be limited to a few or the only one race. And so that hampered a lot of the growth in South Africa and in Africa in general. And so we know that these missionaries who were in Cape Town focused more of their time to the more English-speaking community. There were a small, as I said, there were colored members, but so that was just a small portion of it. But amongst the African or the black community, because of the priesthood limitations and also the policy of the temple ordinances not being extended to the African community, that did limit the growth of the church in South Africa, and particularly in the Africa continent. But like I said, some of these members then left because they wanted to be with the saints, and it was a challenging and a difficult time, because it needed resources for you to be able to travel all the way to Utah. Those who were not well off couldn't really afford these trips, but there were other members who came in who made sacrifices, and some members who were wealthy bought a boat and then offered some of the members a spot in the boat or the ship, so they can be able to travel to the west. And so if you look at the history of the church in South Africa, you will realize that it began with missionaries in 1853, but the church survived because of members who decided to stay in South Africa when other members decided to leave for Utah. Did they do anything wrong? No, of course. They believed and really wanted to be with the saints. They would now receive temple ordinances, and I'm sure they will be blessed for that. But we must be grateful for those members who decided to stay in South Africa and eventually help establish the church in this part of the world. And we know for a fact that 1985, the first temple in South Africa, the Johannesburg temple, was dedicated. And I don't think it would have been possible had all these members of the church who were baptized during that first period or era decided to all leave and go to Utah. So we must really be grateful for those members who stay. We owe the growth of the church to them. We owe the stability and the existence of the church to those members who decided to stay in South Africa. So obviously the ability of the church to expand in Africa was severely limited by this restriction. So what changed? Well, 1978 happened. The prophet and president of the church is Spencer W. Kimball. And he makes this, I would say, shocking to those who didn't expect it, but welcoming to all those who have been waiting eagerly. The president, Spencer W. Kimball, announces that priesthood will now be made available to all worthy male members of the church, regardless of race. All temple ordinances will be made available to all members of the church who are worthy, regardless of race. And for Africa, that began a journey that still continues today, the expansion and the growth of the church in the African continent. The 1978 revelation opened a new chapter for Africa. And if you go to the church website, they talk about church history, and they obviously focus on different areas. They focus on Asia, Europe, and America, as well as Africa and other areas as well. But what I like how they structured the history, that when they talk about these continents, they also talk about the regions, and I just want you to understand the impact that the June 1978 revelation had on the church, particularly in Africa. And I'm going to read some of these things that I'm going to share with you now, because there are a lot of dates, there are a lot of names, and I don't want to get anything wrong, because this is important. The story that began in 1853 in a town of Cape Town, expanding all across Africa. When they talk about, a stone rolled and cut without hands. We learned that in Angola, a group was organized in 1992. The first missionaries arrived in 2008. In Benin, the church arrived in 1990 through missionaries from the Ivory Coast, who taught the members there through telephone. In Cameroon, they began meeting in 1991. The first baptism was conducted in a swimming pool, at an embassy, the Canadian embassy. That's where the first baptism was performed. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, which was obviously originally known as the Zaire, the members overseas started to introduce the church to their family and friends in Congo, because they've now met and came across the gospel where they were overseas, and they felt this is something that their family members needed to learn of, and because it brought so much joy, they knew that this would bring joy to their family members as well. So the church is growing quickly then and now. I know sometimes people who post pictures, they will show you about 300 people receiving the Melchizedek priesthood in one stake conference. I remember there was one picture I saw of 300 baptisms in one stake, and that's how quickly the church is growing in the Congo. But the first temple in the French-speaking African country was dedicated in Kinshasa in 2019. In Ghana, we learned that some of the Ghanaians, discovered the church through literature, and started writing letters to the leaders of the church, petitioning them to send missionaries so they could be baptized. And they, as early as 1960. So the first missionaries arrived in 1978, and we learned that through the church website that the Accra, Ghana temple was then dedicated in 2004. And in Kenya, as early as 1979, many Kenyans began to show interest in the church. So the Nairobi, Kenya temple was dedicated in 2025. So 2025, the first Nairobi temple, very beautiful temple. I wish one day I can be able to go there. Liberia, missionaries arrived in the late 1980s, and although the church was slow in terms of growth because of the civil war there, but the first stake was organized in 2000. In Nigeria, I think Nigeria has the similar experience as the Ghanaians, because the members in Ghana found the church through literature, but also the similar story in Nigeria, where there are members who then discovered the church through literature and obviously through friends as well. But what was interesting with the members in Nigeria is that they had organized themselves unofficially. Can you imagine, knowing that this is the structure of the church, having come across the Book of Mormon and understanding what is to be taught, and you organize yourself in. I don't quite know if they had the organizations and auxiliaries, but they probably did, because they unofficially organized themselves, and they also write to church leaders and ask them to send missionaries. And so what the church does is that it now attempts to establish the mission in Nigeria. But obviously, and this was in early 1960, but the government then, because of this policy of limiting the priesthood to only a certain race, felt that they would not issue visas to the missionaries who would then be coming to establish this mission. But missionaries then were obviously arrived or allowed to come to Nigeria, and the church continues to grow there in Nigeria. And Rwanda, they began meeting regularly in 2007, and on the records it shows that as early as 1980 there were members of the church who were recorded, but the meeting regularly began in 2007. And in Senegal, which is a French-speaking mission, those interested were taught by telephone as well as a video call. And I assume that those were in Cameroon and the surrounding who were in the French-speaking mission then would then call these members from, or those who were interested in the Senegal area through voice and video call. In Sierra Leone, we know that the first branch was established in 1988. In Togo, the first stake was established in 2014. In Zambia, members from South Africa and Zimbabwe moved to Zambia in 1940 and organized, built meeting houses, but the newly independent government stopped granting missionaries visas. So obviously the missionaries left in 1960, but operation resumed in 1990 or around there. But as early as 1990, that's when operations resumed. In Zimbabwe, we know that some South Africans then moved and settled in Zimbabwe in 1920, but the lack of missionary and the restriction on priesthood ordination slowed the growth in that part of the world. And obviously, after the end of the restriction, we saw an exponential growth in Zimbabwe to an extent that, and I think this also came because in the 1980s, that's when the new government, because of the independence, came in and obviously eased some of the restriction placed on the church itself. And so we saw a growth there to an extent that a beautiful temple, I must say, in Zimbabwe was dedicated in 2025. And so you can clearly see that the church has been growing in Africa. The church will continue to grow in Africa. We're expecting more temples. As of December 2025, the church released some statistics that Africa had about over 1 million members. And the congregation, in terms of your wards and branches, were about 3,220. And we were sitting on 54 missions. And there were 8 operating temples. I guess those that were announced or under construction will then this year add to that tally. But this just shows how the Lord has prepared Africa for a very, very, very long time. This just goes to show that the growth that is taking shape in Africa. You know, a lot of members had to do a lot of waiting. You know, a lot of members had to wait for missionaries to come and for them to be baptized and eventually receive these ordinances. Must have been a very painful experience for those who had to wait. The sacrifices, and others because of the government of the day, but also because of the current situation in the particular countries, couldn't get missionaries in their countries, and therefore meant that they would be limited in terms of receiving ordinances. But eventually the Lord opened the doors. We are now seeing more temples in different countries. We are now seeing more missions being opened in different countries. And we must thank the Lord for the growth of the church. The Latter-day Saint Church is growing in Africa, and we must be grateful to be part of this growth. Wherever you are, you know, whether in Congo, whether in Zambia, whether in Nigeria, whether in Uganda, you know, you are part of this great family. And all of us who are here in Africa, we need to be part of this growth that is taking place here in Africa. We need to put our shoulders to the wheel and ensure that the church continues to grow. And that means more members, more temples, more missions, and more wards, branches, stakes, and districts. And yeah, that's just a brief history of what the church is. It's about. You know, it started in 1853. A lot of waiting, a lot of sacrifices, a lot of tears, you know, and missionaries had to go and come back, you know, but the church still stands. And maybe the question we might ask is, why did those who stay decide to stay as opposed to going to the West? And I guess one day we'll get the answer to that, but we must be grateful for their decision to stay in Africa and to help build Africa. So the honors and the commitment now lies on us who are here in Africa to make sure, you know, that we continue to grow the church here in Africa, not just in number, but also in faithfulness, you know, in spirituality, in obedience, you know. And let me know what you think in the comments. Hopefully some may correct the dates or correct the history, but just a brief history that I thought that we might touch on today about the African continent and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Very beautiful history indeed, and I encourage all who are watching to go and do more a study on this history of Africa, and it will help you to appreciate the challenges that the members went through in Africa for us to be able to enjoy these wonderful blessings that we enjoy today. Shap shap. The Spirit of God, like a fire, is burning the latter-day glory begins to come forth. The visions and blessings of old are returning, and angels are coming to visit the earth. We'll sing and we'll shout with the armies of heaven, Hosanna, Hosanna to God and the Lamb. Let glory to them in the highest be given, henceforth and forever. Amen and amen.